Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we really try to unpack the complex stuff, cut through the noise, and, give you the insights you need to understand what's shaping our world. And today, we're diving straight into some pretty big news that broke just this morning, September 9th, 2025. Newsweek's reporting that President Donald Trump has secured his third Supreme Court win this week. This one's tied to a really significant administration case that, frankly, has been making headlines for months now.
Yeah, and this isn't just, another tally mark in the win column. It feels like a genuinely profound moment. It could potentially reshape how we even define American citizenship and maybe the balance of power in government, too.
Absolutely. And at the heart of it is Executive Order 14160. Remember that one? Protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship. President Trump issued it back on January 20th, 2025.
Right. And its goal was to reinterpret the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause, specifically aiming to exclude children born here in the U.S. if their mothers are unlawfully or maybe just temporarily present and their fathers aren't citizens or LPRs.
Which, let's be clear, directly challenged a very long-standing understanding. One that usually gets traced back to that 1898 Supreme Court case, United States v. Wong Kim Ark.
The Wong Kim Ark precedent. That basically established that the 14th Amendment generally grants birthright citizenship to almost everyone born on U.S. soil, kind of regardless of their parent status.
So, as you can probably guess, the legal reaction was, well, immediate and pretty fierce. You had multiple states, New Jersey, Washington were among them, plus advocacy groups, even pregnant women filing lawsuits fast.
Their argument was pretty straightforward. The executive order was unconstitutional. It flew in the face of, over a century of precedent.
And in response, some district courts issued these really broad nationwide injunctions. They called them universal preliminary injunctions, basically stopping the order everywhere.
But the Trump administration didn't just roll over. They pushed back hard. They took the fight over these injunctions straight to the Supreme Court. Their argument that these sweeping orders were a huge overreach of judicial power, challenging the president's authority on immigration and national security.
So today's ruling from the Supreme Court, well, it marks a really key development in what's become a very high-stakes legal and constitutional fight. So today's Supreme Court decision, it's not just about legal jargon or definitions. It really is a window into these deep ideological divides shaping America, both at home and in foreign policy, and how these fights play out globally, too.
And that really is our mission today, isn't it? We want to dive deep into all these interconnected layers. We'll unpack the, let's say, sharp ideological contrast driving U.S. foreign aid policy. We'll explore the legal landscape around executive authority right now. And we'll try to see how these debates actually impact life here and America's role out there in the world. We're going to sift through articles, some research, legal filings, basically pull out the important stuff to give you the clearest picture we can. Cut through the noise, help you understand what's really at stake.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack this. Before we get too deep into the Supreme Court specifics, it feels really important to understand this fierce ideological sort of tug of war that's reshaped U.S. foreign aid. Our sources show a really stark contrast in philosophies, especially if you look at the Trump and Biden administrations. What's the core difference we need to get our heads around here?
Well, what's truly fascinating is how these two administrations kind of represent this much older debate in foreign policy, Is aid mainly a tool for national self-interest, economic pragmatism, or is it more a vehicle for promoting universal values, global equity, that kind of thing?
Right.
For the Trump administration, the core idea for foreign aid was really rooted in economic growth, self-reliance, and making sure it directly aligned with U.S. national security interests. We see reports, like from the Heritage Foundation, highlighting that the goal was for aid to actually build institutions, and the ultimate aim, to eventually end the need for aid altogether.
Okay, so fostering self-sufficiency.
Exactly, promoting private sector-led economic growth as the sustainable fix for global poverty.
So less about just giving aid indefinitely, more about empowering countries to eventually stand on their own.
That's the idea. And this approach really pushed for streamlining things, making them more efficient, getting rid of duplication and waste. There were plans for a complete restructuring of USAID at consolidating health and humanitarian missions into maybe a new, more focused agency, and also empowering the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the MCC, which focuses on economic freedom, good governance. The idea was maybe they could manage all U.S. development assistance.
Interesting.
It also pushed for, reduced spending overall and minimizing congressional micromanagement, through earmarks. The argument was about prudent use of taxpayer money and giving the executive branch more flexibility.
And you mentioned tension with previous policy.
Yeah, a good example is President Obama's 2010 directive. It required agencies to incorporate climate resilience into development aid. Conservatives often saw that as infringing on executive authority and maybe diverting focus from what they saw as core aid goals.
Okay, that paints a very clear picture of the conservative approach. But like you said, that's not the only way people think about foreign aid. The Biden administration shifted gears pretty dramatically, right? Reversed a lot of those policies. And that shift drew some really sharp criticism from certain quarters. They characterized it as using aid to push what they called a rigidly ideological and domestically divisive agenda.
It did. And, a key question that raises is, what exactly does that radical social agenda, as these critics describe it, actually involve? According to sources, again, like the Heritage Foundation, it centers on things like abortion access, climate action, what's termed gender equity, and racial justice.
Okay.
For instance, literally within a week of taking office in January 2021, President Biden reversed restrictions on federal funding for overseas abortion services. Things like the Mexico City policy, which had blocked USAID to international NGOs involved in abortion services or promotion.
No, I remember that.
And he also restored funding to the UN Population Fund, the UNFPA. Increased it, actually, to $70 million. And this was explicitly tied to advancing gender equality globally through reproductive health and women's empowerment programs.
So the critics saw this as basically using American tax dollars to promote specific social issues overseas.
That's precisely how critics framed it, describing it as taxpayer-funded leftist activism or even ideological indoctrination. Another example they point to, USAID's Powered by the People Global Democracy Program, launched November 2021. Critics argued it explicitly endorsed what they saw as Marxist-inspired social movement theory.
But what was the Biden administration's own rationale? I mean, they must have had stated reasons for these choices.
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial distinction. From their perspective, the administration emphasized that these initiatives were vital for promoting human rights, health, and stability around the world. They argued these factors are, intrinsically linked to long-term development and ultimately U.S. national interests as well. They framed it as a progressive, values-driven approach.
Okay, a values-driven approach to global leadership.
Right. Take climate action, for example. The Biden administration put the climate crisis at the center of U.S. foreign policy. Big commitment there. USAID was committed to supporting over 500 million people, mobilizing $150 billion in climate finance by 2030. Huge numbers.
Wow.
But again, conservative critics argued this approach, focusing heavily on decarbonization and politically set carbon targets. Well, it might actually condemn developing countries to permanent underdevelopment.
How so?
By potentially hindering their access to the fossil fuels they might argue they still need for basic energy for economic growth.
That's a really potent counterargument that prioritizing climate action could, maybe inadvertently, stifle progress in the nations we're trying to help.
Yeah.
What about other areas? You mentioned religious freedom.
Yes, that was another point of friction. The Biden administration's approach put religious freedom sort of co-equal with LGBTQI plus rights and abortion access. Critics contended this shift led to USA dismantling its genocide response apparatus, even defunding some Iraqi Christian NGOs.
And why is that significant, according to them?
Well, the argument is that, especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa, churches and faith-based groups manage nearly half the health sector. They're often highly trusted local players.
I see.
There was also that noticeable shift towards multilateralism, more reliance on global groups like COVAX for vaccine distribution. Critics argued this kind of diluted the U.S. public diplomacy impact. Made in America wasn't as visible.
Was there data on that?
Well, they point to figures like by early December 2021, Africa's vaccination rate was still only about 7.5% despite these global efforts, raising questions about how effective that multilateral approach really was in practice, at least early on.
So the overall impact, according to these critics, is that foreign aid risks becoming weaponized in these ideological battles, that it might undermine the goal of self-reliance and potentially jeopardize the bipartisan support foreign aid used to have.
Exactly. And it's important to stress both approaches genuinely believe they're acting in America's best interest. But their definitions of national interest and what constitutes effective aid just diverge so dramatically. That's the root of the ideological divide.
So what does this all boil down to for you listening at home? For you, the taxpayer? It means your hard-earned dollars sent overseas get caught in this ideological crossfire. They get directed toward vastly different goals depending on who's in the White House. And crucially, this same clash over fundamental values, over presidential authority, isn't just happening in foreign policy. It's playing out right here at home. It's shaping the very definition of what it means to be an American citizen. Which brings us right back to today's news in the Supreme Court. This intense ideological debate, it isn't just about foreign aid budgets. It's really at the very heart of these battles over executive power, specifically President Trump's Executive Order 14160 on birthright citizenship.
That's right. That order, from January 20th, 2025, its goal was to clarify the 14th Amendment's citizenship clause. Specifically, that really crucial phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
Okay.
The Trump administration's argument, the one they took to the Supreme Court, is essentially that this clause was never intended to grant automatic citizenship to children born here if their parents are unlawfully present or just temporarily present and lack, meaningful ties to the country.
And they had historical backing for this view.
They argued they did.
Yeah.
They cited historical legal experts, people like Emmerich de Vattel. He was a respected founding-era expert on international law, and Justice Joseph Story, a really prominent Supreme Court justice from the early 19th century. Both of whom, the administration argued, recognized that there could be reasonable qualifications to birthright citizenship.
So their point wasn't that the 14th Amendment itself was wrong, but that its original meaning, especially that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, has been, let's say, misinterpreted over the years.
Precisely. The government's application to the court argues there's a substantial body of historical evidence showing that children of, say, temporarily present aliens or illegal aliens aren't fully subject to the political jurisdiction of the U.S. in the way the amendment originally meant.
And what was the practical implication they were concerned about?
Well, from their perspective, the current policy near universal birthright citizenship had created really strong incentives for illegal immigration, leading to practices like birth tourism, for example. And they also argued it raised national security concerns.
How so, national security?
By extending U.S. citizenship to people who might lack meaningful ties to the country, they argued it could impact the integrity of national sovereignty, fundamentally.
Okay. And as we mentioned earlier, the immediate legal challenge came really fast. Multiple district courts, Washington, Maryland, Massachusetts, others, quickly granted these sweeping, universal preliminary injunctions against the executive order, which, just to remind everyone, meant the order couldn't be enforced anywhere in the U.S., not just for the specific people suing in those courts. That seems like a huge amount of power for one district judge.
It is, and this really gets to a core question about judicial power. The government's application to the Supreme Court heavily criticized these universal injunctions. They described them as a relatively new phenomenon that had reached, quote, epidemic proportions.
Academic proportions. Strong language.
Very. They argued these injunctions are legally and historically dubious, patently unworkable, and that they effectively subvert the Article III hierarchy of judicial review.
Okay, subvert the Article III hierarchy of judicial review. That sounds technical. Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. It basically means they're arguing that a single district judge is acting as if their ruling has the weight and scope of a Supreme Court decision for the entire country. It sort of bypasses the normal appeals process, the established way our courts are supposed to function, where higher courts review lower court decisions.
I see.
So one judge's order can, as they put it, govern the whole nation from their courtrooms.
And you mentioned this was happening more frequently.
Yeah, they pointed out that in February 2025 alone, district courts issued 15 universal injunctions, or TROs, temporary restraining orders against the administration. A really sharp increase compared to previous years.
Wow, 15 in 1 month. That certainly highlights a real tension between the judicial and executive branches.
It really does. And the government argued these broad injunctions were preventing executive agencies from even developing guidance on how to implement the order, effectively paralyzing the executive branch's constitutional duties.
So hamstringing the administration before the policy even gets off the ground.
That was their argument. They also challenged the standing of the states to sue in the first place.
The standing.
Meaning whether the states themselves had actually suffered enough direct harm to even bring a lawsuit on behalf of third parties or to challenge a federal policy like this. Look, this isn't just some procedural spat. It's really a fundamental test of how our branches of government are supposed to interact, especially when a single judge's ruling can halt a nationwide policy. It raises big questions about who ultimately gets to set policy in America. Is it the elected executive, or can individual judges effectively create law through these broad injunctions.
What really stands out here is, yeah, these aren't just abstract legal cases fought out in courtrooms. They have direct impact. They affect the balance of power between the branches, the practical way policies on immigration and citizenship get implemented, things that touch every single one of us.
And if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, what we're seeing is that these ideological clashes over foreign aid and these legal battles over executive orders, they're really two sides of the same coin. It's a fundamental disagreement about America's core values, about its role in the world, and, crucially, about the constitutional limits of presidential power.
Yeah.
These aren't exactly new debates, right? But they feel like they're playing out in new and maybe more urgent ways right now,
Yep.
shaping how the nation defines itself, defines its responsibilities globally.
Exactly. I mean, from how your tax dollars get spent around the world to who is even considered an American citizen.
Right.
These aren't just minor policy tweaks. They feel like foundational decisions. And this tension between, say, fostering self-reliance abroad versus promoting specific social agendas, or between decisive executive action and judicial oversight, it really defines our current political and legal landscape, doesn't it?
It really does. It forces this constant reevaluation.
So considering that whole history of foreign aid, how it started, maybe focused on basic needs, national security, Cold War competition to where it is now, this ideological battleground, and then adding in today's Supreme Court ruling, impacting executive power over something as fundamental as citizenship. The question for you perhaps is this: how effectively can a nation actually govern itself, both at home and internationally, when its foundational principles and even the very definition of its people seem to be in constant legal and ideological flux? Something to think about.